Chapter 25 is the beginning of our investigations of the plant kingdom, and we start this chapter talking about the seedless plants. So the next couple chapters we will talk about the various groupings for land plants, as opposed to the green algae, who were the ancestors of the green plants. These groups form the plant kingdom. Now, when plants evolved and transitioned from a water existence to a land existence, this caused a number of potential problems for the plants. They had to develop strategies through evolution. So those plants who had particular characteristics that gave them a benefit were able to survive. And some of the things that had to be overcome was the issue of drying out, having a structural support, because when plants are in water, when organisms are in water, the water supports them, being able to capture sunlight, and the ability to disperse their reproductive cells, which if you live in water is not a problem. So later on, we first developed plants without seeds, but later on, plants developed seeds, which helped them to even increase their land ability by not having to live in wet areas. We do still have seedless plants in our ecosystem, but they must live in a moist environment. So what are some of the advantages for a plant to living on land? Well, number one, there's more sunlight available to the organism if it's on land than if that sunlight has to go through water. The carbon dioxide is easier to obtain. It's easier for carbon dioxide to go through air than it is to go through water. And initially, for the very first plants that came onto the land, there were fewer predators because the animals were not yet evolved. But once animals evolved, of course, this did become a problem for land plants. So what are some of the adaptations that plants have had to make to live on land? Well, they had to develop an alternation of generations scheme for reproduction, and we'll talk more about that and its benefits. They developed a roots versus shoots anatomy. The roots are the portion of the plant that's under the ground that can anchor them to one position, and the shoots are the above ground parts of the plants through which they have to transport materials. They developed a waxy cuticle, which helps them from drying out, because remember, they're no longer in water. And many plants have developed lignin, which is a chemical that is built into their wood that allows them to have a very strong structural system. This is above and beyond their cell walls. So remember, their cell walls have cellulose, but lignin is an additional material that gives them the ability to grow very tall. So let's talk about this alternation of generations. So when we look at different lifestyles for organisms, we've already looked at the fungi. Now we're just talking here about multicellular organisms. We looked last chapter at the fungi, and we saw that their life cycle was dominant haploid. They spend the majority of their life in the haploid stage. Remember, that's a single copy of every chromosome. And the only diploid component of their life cycle is when they make a zygote. And the zygote is a single cell. So there is no multicellular diploid stage. And then if we look at humans, or animals in general, diploid is the dominant stage. So we spend most of our lives as multicellular diploid organisms, and the only haploid cells that we make, so every organism has a haploid component and a diploid component, but the only haploid component we have is the egg and the sperm cell. Again, only single cells. So how are plants different? Well, plants have something that they call alternation of generations because they have both a haploid multicellular stage like the fungus and a diploid multicellular stage like the humans. So they do alternate between something called the gametophyte, which is their haploid multicellular stage, and their sporophyte, which is their diploid multicellular stage. But they exist for a good deal of time in both of these multicellular stages, where other organisms have one stage or the other where they are multicellular. Now, when we look at different groups of plants, the lower plants, or the plants that were first to evolve after the green algae, in these we find that the gametophyte stage is dominant. They still have a sporophyte multicellular stage, but they spend most of their lives in the gametophyte portion, which is haploid. As plants evolved over time, that gametophyte generation got smaller and smaller, and the plant spends less time in it, and rather the sporophyte generation becomes more dominant. That's the diploid phase. So an example of this are all the flowering plants that you see, the trees, the daffodils, the grasses, etc. Those are all flowering plants, and they spend most of their existence as a sporophyte, which is a diploid multicellular stage. So here's a diagram from the text which further demonstrates this process. So you notice here that there's a gametophyte, which is a single one copy of every chromosome, but it's multicellular. It's not just a single cell. And there is a sporophyte, which is diploid, but it's also multicellular. So what happens is this gametophyte makes gametes, which are haploid. Two gametes fuse together to make a zygote, which is diploid. That zygote grows into a multicellular phase organism, and then it, through meiosis, makes spores, which then grow into a gametophyte, into a multicellular gametophyte. Now, if you're a moss, which is a lower plant, you're going to spend majority of your life in this phase and just do this part really quickly. Whereas if you're an oak tree, you're going to spend the majority of your time in this phase and do this part just very quickly and a very short amount of time. So alternation of generations was an important thing for land plants to be able to do. The other thing to come onto land is that plants had to develop various parts to their anatomy. So what we call the shoots versus the roots. So the shoots, again, are everything that's above ground. The roots are everything that are below ground. And at each end of the shoot and at each end of each root, you have what's called the apical meristem. The apical means it's on the end, and the meristem tells us that this is an undifferentiated group of cells. All these cells here are undifferentiated, which means they haven't figured out what they want to be when they grow up. So they could become anything. So these cells are stem cells, and they can become a range of different types of tissues. So as the roots grow, this apical meristem part of a root will grow down into the dirt, into the soil, and the apical meristem of the shoots, because there's apical meristems on the shoots as well, will grow upward towards the sun. Additional land plant adaptations were involved growing. We just talked about how they grow. They grow at the apical meristems, but our plants are going to grow taller. Now, early land plants didn't grow very, very tall, and that's because they were non-vascular plants. Non-vascular, think of what vascular means. It's a series of tubes. Now, we as humans have a vascular system, which is our arteries and our veins. Plants don't have arteries and veins like us, but they do have tubes in which they transport their liquids. So early plants like mosses and liverworts do not have any of these tubes. They cannot transport water in an efficient manner. Therefore, they can't be very tall because they can't pump that water up into various regions of the plant. Now, plants that develop shoots and roots are growing taller, shoots growing taller towards the sun, and therefore these plants can capture more sunlight. So it's beneficial to grow taller. Additionally, land plants incorporated rigid molecules, the lignin that I mentioned before, which allows them to produce wood. And this, the stronger the stems are, the taller the plant can be. But not all plants produce lignin and therefore make wood. Additionally, once we get to a certain point in evolution, we see the beginnings of vascular tissues. So remember, the mosses, no vascular components, but later on we see vascular tissues develop, and these are tubes which allow for the transport of water and food that's made from photosynthesis. So the xylem part of the vascular system, the xylem tubes, are going to conduct water and minerals from the roots to the shoots. So from the soil up throughout the plant shoots. And the phloem tubes are going to transport around in the plant the products of photosynthesis, the sugars that the plants make in the shoots, and even store that material down in the roots. Our third thing that plants needed to evolve was protective waxy cuticle. So this keeps the leaves from drying out. So if you look here on this edge of the upper epidermis of a leaf, we're looking sideways into a leaf, we see that there will be a waxy covering on the very, very top. And this helps to prevent water loss. Unfortunately, though, because of this makes a protective cover, it's harder for CO2 to get in. So that is a problem because the CO2 needs to get in, as we remember from last semester, in order for photosynthesis to happen. So what happened was the evolution. Plants that had stomata or pores had a space, a hole that allowed for carbon dioxide to be let into the leaves. So that overcame the problem of trying to protect the leaves from drying out. Additionally, another protective component are pigments in the leaves that developed, and this would prevent them from UV rays, particularly the UVB rays, and these could damage the leaf tissues. Another protective mechanism that plants developed was so that after animals came on the scene, some plants that had bitter or poisonous chemicals in them called alkaloids would deter predators from eating them. So that would keep them from being eaten. And ironically, some plants that co-evolved with animals developed parts of them that were sweet and enticing for animals, like fruits, so that animals would eat the fruits and then process them in their digestive system and pass the seeds from the fruits out in their feces, and that would help the plant in dispersing pollen and seed grains. So now let's take a look at the evolutionary process for the green plants, we see here the charophytes. These are not plants. These are protists, but they're the ancestors from which the plants evolved. So from these charophytes evolved the land plants. We can then subdivide all the plants on the land as either non-vascular or vascular plants. So a non-vascular plant will not have those xylem and phloem tubes, whereas a vascular plant will have the xylem and phloem tubes. So now let's look within the non-vascular group. We will take a look at the components within the non-vascular group, and they are all seedless plants. So not only are they non-vascular, but they do not make seeds. We call them the bryophytes. So the bryophytes is a name that you should remember. Everything with a check mark is a grouping that you should remember. If we take a look at the vascular plants and how we subdivide them, we have both seedless plants and seeded plants. So we have seedless plants only in the non-vascular, but we have seedless and seeded plants in the vascular group. And then if we go down and look at what particular examples you need to know from each group, so I would like you to know about the liverworts and the mosses, which are two examples of seedless non-vascular plants. For the seedless vascular plants, I'd like you to know about ferns. These are some others, but just details about the ferns. And then for the seeded plants, we're going to look at the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. So those green algae, they're the ones who were the ancestors to our plants. Remember, they're called the charophytes. And how do we know that? Well, we can go back and look at fossil records and also existing charophytes and see that they contain carotenoids and chlorophyll A and B, just like our green plants, as well as they both the charophytes and the land plants, store carbohydrates as starch. So these are two pieces of evidence that the charophytes were the ancestors of our green plants. And here's an example of a charophyte. So now let's go in and take a look at our first group of plants. Remember, those are the non-vascular plants. They do not have xylem and phloem. We call them the bryophytes, and they evolved about 450 million years ago. There's a good number of species, about 25,000. You don't need to remember that exact number, but there's quite a few of them. And they really need to live in damp habitats because of the fact that they are non-vascular. They don't have a way to pump water around in their bodies, so therefore they need to be near water. There are some that live in deserts, but these are a very, very small number. We're going to remember that they need to live in damp habitats. There are 3 phyla: the liverworts, the hornworts, and the mosses. So I had in here, you remember the liverworts, and here's a picture of them, because they are thought to have been the very first land plants, the hornworts. The liverworts. And then the hornworts, there's a picture of them here, and then here we have a picture of the mosses. One thing you should notice about all of them is that they're very low to the ground. Very, very low to the ground. That is because they do not have a vascular system. They can't grow tall. The other thing to notice is that in all of the plants that you see, majority of the plant, all of this green, that's the gametophyte or the haploid generation, because these non-vascular plants spend the majority of their alternation of generations as a gametophyte. They only produce a sporophyte very quickly as an extension when they want to reproduce. So here is a sporophyte. Here is the sporophytes in the moss. You don't even see them because this is not in the stage. This liverwort is not in the stage where it is going to be producing a sporophyte generation. So a little bit more about that alternation of generation for non-vascular plants. The gametophyte is dominant. That's what we see here, this gametophyte. We have two of them here. On the gametophyte, you will have something called an archegonia. The archegonia make the haploid egg. So think the gonia part means egg. So the archegonia is this structure right here, and it is going to produce an egg. Then this is all haploid. The antheridia, we see another extension here. The antheridia is going to make the sperm. So also one N, haploid. They do make a flagellated sperm, a sperm with a flagellum that can swim to the egg. Remember, these are all in wet environments, very close to the water. When they fertilize, so here we have the sperm, which actually enters the archegonial head. So it enters in, fertilizes the egg stays in there, produces an embryo, which is 2N, diploid. That embryo grows, makes spores. The spores get released. And then remember the spores, if you see that word spore, it's always haploid. That spore gets released and grows into a new moss or liverwort, and it is haploid. So it grows into a new gametophyte. Also, I want to make note of these little extensions here. They help to anchor the bryophyte to the ground. They're called rhizoids. They're primitive roots. So we can't really call them roots, as we'll see later on, but they're the bryophyte's answer to roots. So the sporophyte is very dependent on the gametophyte. So the sporophyte, which forms inside this archegonial head, up here, we see it extended up here, produces haploid spores, and they grow into the new gametophyte. And that happens very quickly, not for a very long time. Okay, let's move on to the vascular plants. The vascular plants evolved about 430 million years ago. And what's the key to vascular plants? They have xylem, which transports water and minerals. They have phloem, which transports the sugars that are made through photosynthesis. So we see that this tissue is made up of a series of conducting cells and parenchyma, which is supporting tissue. If it's xylem, it also has lignin for mechanical strength. So remember, lignin is the stuff that we find in wood, but that is in and around the xylem tissue to help give it strength. But the tubes are not, will not leak water. So they also help to support the plant to get stronger. So this is how a plant that doesn't have wood can still be somewhat tall. The xylem is going to transport the sugars, proteins, anything else the plant makes, and it goes through its conducting cells, which are called sieve elements, and it also has some supporting cells. So if we look here at this microscopic cross-section, this is a series of vascular tissue. This part is xylem, this part is the phloem. So the tubes are all together. And if you've ever looked at the end of a piece of celery and you see these little circles here, that is what you're seeing right there. Xylem and phloem, and the tubes go down the length of the stalk of celery. So to be vascular, you have to have a vascular system. That was number one. Number two is you're going to have roots. So when we talked about the bryophytes, which I'm showing you here, they just had those rhizoids. They did not have true roots. But if you're a vascular plant, you need to have true roots. So we see that after the evolution of vascular tissue, we have the evolution of true roots, which are really able to support the plant in getting taller. The roots are able to absorb water and minerals from the soil and transfer them throughout the plant using the xylem. The roots also, as we've seen before with the fungi chapter, form a symbiotic relationship with the mycorrhizae, and that helps the plant as far as absorbing phosphorus. The fungi absorb and pass the phosphorus onto the plants, to the roots, and it allows for a place where nitrogen-fixing bacteria, we saw that way back in a couple chapters ago, which can transfer nitrogen to the roots. The third thing in vascular plants is that they have leaves, flowers, and cones. Not all of them have all three, but if they do have true leaves, this really helps photosynthesis. They're very good and efficient at photosynthesis, and they come in many different forms. So many different shapes, as well as they can even be the needles that we find on gymnosperms or pine trees. Flowers are specialized leaves which were modified to be reproductive structures. So we're going to find the gametes of the plants in the flowers, the eggs and the sperm. And cones are also reproductive structures which contain the gametes. Okay, so now let's talk about seedless vascular plants. So they are the ferns. So when we were talking about bryophytes, remember that from the bryophyte, they were dependent on water. They had to be close to the ground and close to moisture so that they could get the water into their plant surfaces. They lack roots, and they don't have the xylem and the phloem, and so that limited the bryophytes to very small sizes. But vascular plants can get quite tall because they can reach for the sunlight. In seedless vascular plants, we find that the diploid sporophyte generation is the dominant phase. So in our bryophytes, which were non-vascular seedless, their dominant phase was the gametophyte. Here, for our seedless vascular plants, and we're going to only look at the ferns, the diploid sporophyte is the dominant phase. But for these guys, for these ferns, because they don't make seeds, their reproduction is still going to depend on being near water for fertilization. So they're going to release their eggs and sperm, and so they're still going to need water surfaces. So you still find ferns mostly living in damp environments. So, more about ferns. These are seedless vascular plants. The sporophyte is the dominant generation. It's much larger than the gametophyte, and it makes haploid spores that will then grow into the haploid gametophyte. Remember, you always go alternate back and forth, sporophyte to gametophyte, gametophyte to sporophyte. So here, if we look at the underside of a fern, you may see these little circles, and you might think that's some sort of infection or insect eggs, but in fact, these are little pockets of spores, haploid spores, that the fern will release. Now, those spores will grow into a gametophyte. The gametophyte will have an archegonia. Remember that gone part of the word means it's going to produce a haploid egg, and an antheridia, which will produce haploid sperm. These sperm do have a flagellum because they have to swim to the egg, and fertilization will result in a diploid sporophyte. So we will have the sperm to the egg, and we'll get a diploid sporophyte, which will then grow into this generation. This generation will then make haploid spores, get released, form this, and so forth. So here are some examples of seedless vascular plants. We looked at the fern. Here's another fern here. Here's a fiddlehead, which is a curled up part of the sporophyte that has not elongated. Here are a couple other seedless vascular plants. They are not ferns, but you may see them. These are horsetails, and these are whisk ferns. They aren't really ferns. But for our class, we're going to focus in on just the ferns. So ferns are the most readily recognizable seedless vascular plants. They're considered the most advanced of the seedless vascular plants, and they have a lot of the same characteristics that you do find in seeded plants. There's more than 20,000 species living in all kinds of environments, but usually in fairly warm environments, warm and wet. Although most ferns can live in dry environments, although some ferns can live in dry environments, most of them are in moist. And the sporophyte's the dominant stage. We call those large groupings of leaves on a fern the fronds. Here is the alternation of generations for ferns. The sporophyte, remember everything here is diploid. The sporophyte forms spores. The spores get released, forms them through meiosis. They get released. The spores grow into a gametophyte. So this is the gametophyte, which has both an archegonium and an antheridium. Archegonium has the egg. Antheridium has the sperm. These are low to the ground. And then these will come together. Sperm will fertilize egg, form a diploid zygote, which will grow into a new sporophyte. Those little groupings of spores on the underside of the fronds, spores are called sori. The spore groupings are called sori. And here we see a young gametophyte with a new sporophyte growing out of it. So the sporophyte will be able to get quite tall. So what are some of the importance of seedless plants? So remember, we have both vascular and non-vascular seedless plants. The mosses, which are non-vascular seedless plants, form the base of the food chain in the tundra, because not much can grow there. Those bryophytes, which mosses are, make the soil better for colonization of other plants. They improve the soil. The ferns, which are seedless vascular plants, add to the environment by breaking down rocks, for accelerating the formation of topsoil and slowing down erosion, holding the soil in place. Now, dried peat moss, or sphagnum, which is a moss, is commonly used as fuel and is a renewable resource. And florists use blocks of sphagnum moss, peat moss, to add to floral arrangements. And that finishes our chapter on the beginnings of the plant kingdom. And our next chapter, we will look at the seeded plants, and all seeded plants are vascular plants.